Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Michael Morris. Michael, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you, Nick. Hope you are too.
I am, for the most part, and we're also joined by the wise and venerable Mr. Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you, sir?
As Pierce Brosnan once said, just surviving. He was the second best Bond.
Yeah,
he was the second best Bond. I won't. No. There are things we can debate as reasonable people. This is not one of them. Roger Moore, Pierce Brosnan.
We'll avoid too much drama by staying away from who's the best Bond. Michael, I think I'm going to have to come up with a ridiculously over-the-top, self-glorifying nickname for you as well, to match some of the other greats that we've had on the show. But anyway, that's not why I presume our listeners are tuning in. They are, of course, tuning in to find out about what's going on in the country. And this is a story that caught my eye and also Michael's eye. And I remember this caused quite a stir when it first happened, and then it sort of died down, and I assumed that the problem had been solved. Well, it turns out that it hadn't quite been solved. So the potential economic impact of the polyphagous shot-hole borer, which is a type of beetle, an invasive species, has been estimated by a group of researchers from the University of Stellenbosch to that economic damage it may cause may be around 288 billion rand over the next decade, and that municipalities in particular will have to bear the brunt of this cost if nothing is done to stem the tide. This beetle entered South Africa in 2012. It's suspected to have come possibly on a container ship. Maybe it was hiding amongst wood products or something. And it was detected in Durban in 2012, so 10 years ago. It's now spread to 8 provinces, and it is the largest outbreak of this invasive pest globally. Many of our invasive species are only really a problem in rural areas, in sort of on crops and on plantations and that kind of thing. But this one, it's believed will affect municipal areas to quite a large degree. So this group that came up with this research, they consisted of economists at the Stellenbosch University School for Public Leadership and ecologists at the DSINRF Center for Excellence for Invasion Biology at Stellenbosch, which is part of the university's Conservation Ecology and Entomology Institute. They built a model to try and predict how much economic damage will be caused. Now, I'm a little bit skeptical of that number they came up with. 288 billion rand, even over 10 years, is quite a lot of money. But maybe I'm wrong. I mean, after all, they did the research. But I'm a little bit suspicious of it. But let's go forth nonetheless. They estimate that Stellenbosch alone will lose something like 20,000 of the big old oak and plane trees that line its streets. And apparently, this beetle is not, in fact, yet listed as an alien and invasive species under regulations, making it difficult for municipalities to react effectively, which is quite concerning, I think, because, well, it's been here for 10 years. It hasn't been in every province for 10 years, but you'd think that government would have moved fast on this one. Or maybe not, I suppose. The research has gone to say that the eradication of this beetle, because it is so widespread, is effectively impossible, but there are efforts that can be done to control it. It apparently can only spread to about 2 kilometers away from where it currently is, but even a single female can start a huge colony of these things. And they're very small. They're like just a few millimeters long. I think the females at larger size are about 2.5 millimeters long, and males are about 1.6 millimeters. So a difficult problem to solve for any government. But Michael, you had some thoughts on this. I do fear that we're not particularly well equipped to deal with this kind of problem. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I have a sort of range of thoughts. One that I really just thought of now, because of the obvious association of sort of alien invasion, is of course one of the two big things that came in during the Anglo-Boer War, aside from the British Tommies, but came in with a feed, I think mainly from South America, from Argentina, I think, was kakibos and the cosmos flowers, which a lot of people tend to think of as being part and parcel of growing up in South Africa.
Did we also get blackjacks from Australia?
I think very likely. So one is, this is a kind of theme of things. As a tree lover, anything that's affecting trees is something that I feel kind of quite anxious about. And yet philosophically, I think it's probably quite useful to have these things, because they do remind us that in the youth of our humanity, that being this tiny part of this much larger thing called nature does actually make us quite vulnerable, and partly because we know so little about it. We're still learning. The extent of our knowledge of nature is actually quite tiny, I suspect, compared to what it might be, say, in 20,000 years' time. And we tend to overlook that. We tend to forget how little we know. So it's quite useful to get these lessons, I think. Although after COVID, perhaps nature could give us a bit of a break. And the other thing, which is
stop that.
No, probably not. But on that theme, you think where there are these threats to our way of living and our way of running economies and cities and so on, that you would think concerted action is really the way to go. But in fact, there tends to be a counter response to that from much of humanity. We don't want world government. We don't want big organizations telling us what to do and so on. So it is quite an interesting thing. It's quite an interesting phenomenon. You have this threat. It does require some kind of concerted action, and yet we're very suspicious, and with good reason, about cities or governments taking action to do good things, what is assumed to be good things. But the key thing is that it's nature putting us in our place, in a sense, and we have to make quite careful choices.
So, Terence, as for the economic costs here, the researchers here are estimating something like 28 billion rand a year over 10 years. Now, that's quite a high figure. I don't know. Does that sound reasonable to you? And what do you make of this story? I mean, I do fear that our ability to control the sort of ecological, that our ecological control systems are not doing that well at the moment. I know that there are problems with like foot and mouth and stuff that come across the borders from other countries. What do you make of this story?
Well, I think first shout out to the Port of Durban that actually managed to get a container off.
Hey.
Biosecurity is one of these things that is critically important to an economic ecosystem, but it barely registers in most people's consciousness. 28 billion a year. I can, given what things cost and what things can be made to cost. Hint, hint, wink, wink. That number might actually come out as conservative, but if you think about what is it, 20,000 oak trees in Stellenbosch, if these have to be removed, you're talking a couple of thousand for each one. So that number, I think can be may well prove to be correct. I remember
that. Right. I mean, if this beetle gets out of control, you can imagine perhaps the leafy suburbs of Johannesburg not being so leafy anymore.
Yeah, well, look, when we have an outbreak of something like foot and mouth disease, most of us aren't going to register it because that's happening on a farm, and we still have steak in the supermarket shelves somehow. But how precarious that can that supply chain can be, it's a major concern for farmers. And this is often reported in a very decontextualized way. There's been a conflict between a commercial farmer and subsistence farmers over, cattle straying onto a farm, and I think the kind of instinctive response is, well, where's the harm? Okay, it's inconvenient, but they came and took them away. But if they could be bearing some sort of pest, if they are not inoculated up to spec, that can destroy the entire operation. A couple of years ago, there was a minor story about Cyril Maposa's farm in Limpopo, which had to and he had to dismiss a whole bunch of his farm workers. And And well, this was Cyril the businessman. Apparently, that part of the country had just been whacked by foot and mouth, and those farming enterprises were not making any money. So he did what a businessman needs to do, although something which as a politician he would castigate anyone else for doing. But yeah, and this global economy, we can get our SpongeBob SquarePants toys from China in a heartbeat. But there's always the danger of sort of what is riding in the cargo hold. Australia, because of its geographic position, was sort of cordoned off from the rest of the world with a very unique ecosystem. A big economic and political issue became things like cane toads, rabbits, camels, horses. That were turned loose there. Very destructive to the local environment, and also not great for agriculture, not great for tourism. You want to go and see kangaroos in Australia, and all you get to see is big ugly cane toads.
So this brings to mind a debate that I've seen a little bit going on in the sort of conservation circles, which is the debate about what to do about invasive species and whether to treat all invasive species as something that needs to be eradicated or some. And I must say I am sympathetic with the idea that once a tree or something has been here for a long time, and if it hasn't gotten out of control, then it's probably not such a bad thing to have it, even if it's not great. Like I know that a lot of the complaints made about foreign trees in South Africa is that they drink too much water and they damage our water supplies. But I do think that some of that is overblown. I mean, I know that there are parts of Johannesburg, for example, that since invasive trees started to be removed, the water table has risen a little bit, and so they flood a little bit often. So I don't know. I think there's a balancing act here that some very hardcore environmentalists don't necessarily take into effect, which is, once something is into the environment, you can't actually fully go back to a sort of pristine nature, and you shouldn't expect to. At the end of the day, things do sometimes migrate. Of course, humans speed that process up, but I don't know, Michael. What do you think about that debate? Clearly, in this case, these beetles are a very big problem and should be treated as a major pest. But I'm not sure if all invasive pests should be seen the same. What do you think?
I absolutely agree. Just quite recently, my wife bought for me an entrance fee to a tree walk with a tree specialist around a very special park quite near us. And at some point, I very proudly mentioned to this highly qualified tree person that as a hobby, I grew indigenous trees from seeds. And she looked down her nose at me and said, "Why only indigenous? What have you got against?" And in fact, I grow. Among the historical oddities I have in the garden at the moment are some tiny saplings of trees from the camphor trees at Vergelegen, which were brought here by Simon van der Stel. And so it's a rather special little link there with a sort of long history of kind of global links between Africa and elsewhere. But I think it's true that to be puristic about it, I think is puritanical. Really, is misguided. And I started off by saying that we are really part of nature, and the human story is one of moving around into new environments and having to adapt to them, and the environments, of course, having to adapt to us, I guess, too. And this is a sort of ongoing thing. Coming back to Terence's point, we require of nature to deliver certain things. We wouldn't survive if we didn't organize that quite efficiently, and farmers do it with extraordinary skill and tenacity. And I know that the two species I mentioned right at the beginning, the Kakibos and the Cosmos, I think register as very, very expensive costs for the agricultural economy in terms of eradicating and controlling these two species that came in, as I said, during the Anglo-Boer War to feed the invading forces, horses, you could say. So it is, I think, they're trade-offs, but one shouldn't be overly precious about it, that there are marvelous animals too, but certainly trees and little bugs who perhaps haven't always belonged in Southern Africa, but are here now. And that's not a good reason to think that they don't deserve to be here. We've got to learn to live with them in some way.
All right, let's move on to our next story. And this is, I must say, I'm not sure if SARS has struck before, but employees at SARS who are associated with the Public Servants Association and the National Education and Allied Workers Union, the HAWU will commence a strike this morning, demanding a major wage increase. Apparently, the strikers are demanding consumer price inflation, which is about 6% at the moment, something like that, plus a 7% increase. But SARS has told them that this is unaffordable. SARS has maintained that the 3 billion rand boost to the tax authority from Inokonongwana's budget did not account for wage increases, and so they will not be able to afford the increase that unions are demanding. Terence, what do you make of this? Seems like quite a big wage increase that they're demanding.
Yeah, look, I suspect that this demand is kind of an opening shot. I think they would probably settle for much less, but I do think it's an interesting phenomenon in South Africa that the public service seems to have an assumption that their wages or their remuneration will increase every year in real terms. I think there was a big story some time ago in China. They were getting the first real increase in 10 years. So yeah, look, working for the state in South Africa, I think has a number of benefits. It pays reasonably well. It's very secure, and I think for a lot of people, that security is something they crave. That you can stay here pretty much your whole life. You can retire with a decent pension. Tick tick. That's one issue. Where this I think will go down very, very badly is amongst people outside the civil service who've been bearing the brunt of retrenchments, wage cuts, enforced furloughs, etc., etc., etc. And I think it's something sort of particularly significant and poignant when the tax authority says, we the guys that take your money now. We want a Bonzella.
I was just about to say, this seems like the ultimate sort of insult. It's like, not only are we going to take your money, but we're going to demand even more.
But I think that there's kind of a story behind the story. I wonder. It just says something about the crisis that this country has come to. That the one big pay packet that the government has control over, let's say its ultimate patronage, which is the civil service. They're now saying, there is no money for more. I remember there is no money being a mantra over the years. At the end of the day, there was always a little bit more. It's like Doug the Pug. There's always room for a little more food. But I think now that cupboard is bare, and it's we're up against a hard margin. Yeah, it's not going to be pleasant.
Michael, any thoughts on this before we move on?
I mean, one of the things that I pick up every now and then, just talking to ordinary people, is how there's a kind of mounting resentment about paying anything to a government that is so wasteful, so corrupt, and so on. It just so happened some weeks ago when the census people were coming round, and I decided to do the kind of in-person option. And this very pleasant young woman came to the door, and I said, "Well, let's make some tea and we'll sit outside and we'll have a good chat." And I was then, when we'd finished doing all the sort of data gathering on my behalf, I asked her a bit about how it was going and what her experience had been. And she said, well, she'd just been to a house where the person had refused to see her because he said, I'm a businessman and I work very hard for all the money that I earn, but you people just waste it and you're all corrupt. And of course, it's quite misplaced, but you have this sense of the kind of sentiment out there that people, anything to do with the state is seen to be, wasteful and undeserved and so on. So I think Terence is right. There's a not a very good sentiment associated with the tax collectors per se, but especially asking for more pay. It just doesn't go down very well.
I think there's a sense of a disconnect between deserving something and proper reward. Now, SARS is, let's say, has traditionally been one of our better institutions.
Yeah.
But as someone pointed out in the comments, they showed a lack of enthusiasm to chase the ruling party, which hadn't paid taxes for years. That is extremely galling. And I think especially for honest people who are maybe not in sympathy with the government, that like, we didn't do this, but hey, we're rebuilding, and please give us more money. No, it's the middle class in this country, and I'm speaking to, I think, the informed and the converted. You pay your taxes, then you have to sort of privatize yourself out at your own expense. Look, SARS also has not done itself any favors in the public sentiment, I think, with some of their more aggressive recent tactics. Multiple audits and foot dragging. There was a thing in the Daily Maverick about it, and I personally had experience with it as well. But yeah, sign of a very broken social contract.
Very well said. I'd also just like to give a quick shout out to regular listener David, who says he has returned from having 40 hours of no electricity. Straight to your arm, David. Hope that you are okay now and that you didn't lose anything in the fridge or anything like that. Right, let's go on to our next story. And this is about everyone's favorite organization, the World Health Organization, which has just re-elected its chairman, Dr. Tedros from Ethiopia. I think, what is he now, on his third or fourth term? Anyway, point is, he's just been re-elected, and this is to be expected as there was no one running against him. He received 155 of 160 votes, and I assume the rest were abstentions or spoiled ballots. Interestingly, he did not receive support from his home country of Ethiopia. He was very quickly congratulated by Germany and the United States. Germany is now the biggest donor to the World Health Organization, as the US has dropped some of its contributions to the World Health Organization. He said he addressed the United Nations Assembly soon after his re-election, and he said the WHO's focus will be on emergency preparedness and the improvement of the agency. This pandemic has been very unprecedented, and many lessons that we should learn, and there are many lessons that we should learn and are learning. But at the same time, we cannot just pause, learn, and implement. Instead of pausing to learn, we're saying, while learning, let's implement. He was congratulated by most countries in the world, particularly the Germans and the Americans. I must say, I'm not a huge fan of Dr. Tedros here, particularly for his early conduct in the COVID pandemic, when he was very supportive of the line coming out of China, despite the fact that Taiwan had made clear that there was at least some early evidence from the end of 2019 that there might be human-to-human transmission of COVID. And while he has, I think, criticized China since then, that early sort of desire to just completely trust the Chinese authorities and official line on COVID, I think, was very damaging to what happened afterwards. And I do not think the WHO has covered itself in a tremendous amount of glory during this pandemic. But Terence, what do you make of this? It seems to me that that there is no one organizing against him. What do you make of the politics of this?
Well, look, I think that UN agencies have long been political fora. The Chinese have been very skillful in using them to advance their interests, far more than America has the muscle to act on its own, and I think quite often they open the door for their opponents to take up a sort of multilateral banner, which a lot of middle and smaller powers find very attractive. And then and I think ultimately in this case, you ended up supporting China's preferred candidate. Now, that being said, my opinion about Tedros closely matches your own. I think that the world is probably in the state it is in. Well, I think I will say that as my conviction. The world on COVID went the way it went because of China's actions. It not only concealed the spread of the pandemic, but it browbeat countries like the Philippines that initially wanted to restrict flights and that sort of thing, into not doing so. And also, look, simply because we, from a personal standpoint, I thought that his comments about Taiwan were utterly disgusting. He was, this is all Taiwan, and they were mobilizing racist sentiments against him. I think absolute nonsense. Taiwan, I think, is probably the country in the world treated worse by the UN and its agencies. Not being recognised by most states. But I think it actually goes to a great deal of effort to behave as a responsible global citizen. I lived in Taiwan during the SARS outbreak, and China refused, basically pressured the World Health Organization, various other agencies, not to have any contact with Taiwan, despite the fact that China was concealing its own information and Taiwan was making its information very freely available. And then they sort of went on the record, no, don't worry about China. The People's Republic is taking care of their health. The only thing that they tried to do was to block Taiwan from any external assistance, which, shout out to the Americans, the United States is willing to provide. And I do think if one thing has come out of this pandemic, it has been a realization of the type of regime that the People's Republic of China is. And I was very encouraged, for instance, to see the Japanese donating COVID vaccines to Taiwan, even though they don't have formal diplomatic relations. But yes, look, Tedros, I think, is an international bureaucrat who has relied on patronage to get where he is, and I don't think that don't expect much different.
Michael, what do you make of this?
I mean, I feel sure that whoever was going to be heading anything like a global response to something like COVID is going to be mired in controversy, but there clearly is, in the case of Tedros, these indications of.
I believe there's been a lot of criticism leveled at him for his conduct in dealing with, I think it was a cholera outbreak in Ethiopia before he was in the WHO.
Indeed, yeah. Indeed. And just looking at just having a quick glance at his wiki entry in 2017, for instance, he chose Robert Mugabe as a WHO Goodwill Ambassador to help tackle non-communicable diseases in Africa. This is clearly
there's a lot of goodwill around Bob.
Yeah, and it notes here that observers said Tedros was returning a campaign favor. Mugabe was chair of the African Union when he was endorsed as a sole African Union candidate, and so on. So as Terence said, this is highly politicized. One has a sense of professional bureaucrat who's doing his best to stay on top. Certainly the issue with Taiwan and China was glaring. It doesn't look very good. And one wonders, the sole candidate, either nobody else really wants the job, or he's just managed to manipulated process which delivers his own candidacy as the sole option.
I suspect it's probably a little bit of both on that last point there, Michael.
Look, I think that these are fora that the United States needs to take seriously because the Chinese do. And I don't think that they can afford to let them slide. Interestingly, when Trump withdrew the United States from the World Health Organization, I think they're back in now, jack in the box. But there was a piece that I read, which I thought was a very sober reflection on it, saying that it's kind of gone overboard, and this is foolish and it deprives them of any influence. But it's an organization that is sorely in need of reform, and a non-negotiable should be Tedros has to go. He's shown himself to be unsuited to the job, and to be too closely aligned with America's geostrategic opponents. So,
yeah.
Yes, well, that is, I think, the battle of the UN is one we're going to see intensify over the next couple of years. As relations continue to worsen between China and the United States. But anyway, that's far too big a topic for now. We are out of time for today. Thank you very much for watching. We hope that you enjoyed the show, that you found it interesting. And we will, of course, be back tomorrow on the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.